Well, I'm really deeply honored that Bob invited me to speak to you this morning. When he invited me, I didn't know the name Rajan Kilachan. And yesterday, I must say, I was just overwhelmed by Rajan's generosity to Boston University. And it is a spectacular example of what science needs. And I'm going to talk this morning about the role of philanthropy in basic research. And I have to begin that discussion by talking about the role of federal government in funding basic research, because certainly in the United States, I think in all countries, the primary responsibility for funding basic science has to come from the federal government. So let me show you a few features of that and the history of federal funding for science in the United States. So this is a chart, I hope you can see it, of the expenditures by the federal government on research and development. The red curve is not as a fraction of non-defense spending, federal non-defense discretionary budget, and the blue is including defense. And what you can see is the amazing fact that except for the Apollo program in the 1960s, that R&D has been a constant fraction of the discretionary budget. And it's hard to ask for more than that, right? The problem is, if you look at how that discretionary budget is made up, you take it apart into different components, you can see that the gray curve is defense, non-R&D defense spending. The red curve includes all kinds of investments, such as research and education. The only component that is growing as a percentage is payments to individuals. And that's growing extremely rapidly. This is what you hear referred to as entitlements. It's dominated by Medicare and Medicaid, payments to old people like me. Under these circumstances, the discretionary part of the budget has to shrink, because everything is going to these payments to individuals. Unless the country figures out how to pay for that, either by increased revenues or slowing the growth, there's an inexorable decrease in the discretionary budget. And for that reason, our investments in GDP for the nation as a whole, and this includes all expenditures, not just the federal governments, but industries as well, has gone from first in the world as a fraction of GDP to 10th. And if you believe, as most economists do, that R&D is the driver of the economy, this spells really bad things for the long-term health of the economy. So that's really scary. And you can see it here, but what actually has happened is that although the R&D percentage of the GDP is going down, that's the top curve, if you ask just about research, it's actually done much better. So we often complain about the government not funding research. Actually, it's funded research much better than development. It's development that has been curtailed dramatically. Another way to look at this is if you look at basic research as a percentage of the GDP, until about 2005, it was really doing very well. So we really have nothing to complain about as researchers, but we have a lot to be afraid of. And you can see that downturn in the last 5 years, particularly the steep downturn since 2012. That was what's called the sequester, when all discretionary spending began to be cut. It was inevitable because of the background that I told you, that if the discretionary budget keeps shrinking, eventually it's going to hit research as well. At the same time, there's an additional dramatic change in how that research money is spent. And this is a plot of federal funding by discipline. The top curve is the life sciences, and you can see this huge increase in the late 1990s. That was the doubling of the NIH budget. And of course, if you keep research spending constant and you increase the NIH budget, it has to come from somewhere. And it came from engineering, and it came from the physical sciences. So we've had a huge shift in how the research money is distributed, and I don't think anyone has addressed seriously what that means for the long-term health of the economy. So I think it's particularly wonderful that the new Kilochon Center is bringing together life sciences with engineering and physical sciences, because it helps maintain the physical sciences infrastructure at the same time. So what are the universities doing under these circumstances when research funding from the federal government begins to decline? And again, you can see the top curve is these are plots of where the universities in the United States get the money for research. Where do the revenues come from? And the top curve is the federal government component. It's still the biggest, but you can see it's declining in the last few years. The curve which is rising, the only curve which is rising as a percentage, is the university's own expenditures. And where do those come from? Those come from gifts like the one we're celebrating today. They come from the endowments of the universities, which they can spend on helping to hire new faculty members by giving them startup packages, by providing seed funds for new initiatives. This is what is keeping the enterprise going now, is the increase in philanthropy that has built up endowments of the universities. So that's the background. One more piece of the background is that with this current administration, there's not much hope that things will get better from the federal government. So these are the proposed cuts in the science budgets by the Trump administration. Really dramatic, draconian cuts in every agency except DARPA, the defense agency. The NIH was proposed a 20% cut. The NSF was proposed a 10% cut. These are not going to happen because wise people in Congress are not going to allow it to happen. But it tells you that the direction is not a good one. And unless we can change things in Washington, it will continue to be quite scary. So what is the role of private funding, of philanthropy in this situation? We did a survey last year for the second time. We asked all the AAU, American Association of Universities, all the universities to fill out the survey. Only about half of them could do it. I was pleased that BU did fill it out. Harvard said they have absolutely no way of knowing how much money they get every year, because and I believe it, because they are so decentralized. In the first year, Stanford also said they couldn't do it, but they figured out how to do it by the second year, so that was good. We asked them about the sources of their philanthropic funding and what they go for. And this is just one piece of what we learned. We got a number of over $2.3 billion in philanthropic funding for basic research in 2016. And again, that's an underestimate because we missed some important players. But it's very unlikely that the number is more than 4 billion or something like that if you include all the universities. And so I think this gives you a sense of the overall scale of philanthropy for basic research and where it goes. And you can see that, like the federal government, the vast majority goes for biomedical research. So what can we say from this and other things we know about philanthropic funding is that it's a fraction of the federal funding. It's not going to make up for cuts of the size that Donald Trump proposed. It's just not on that scale. But it does some things that are really different from what the federal government does. It can target areas that the government won't cover. And the philanthropists that we talk to really want to do things the federal government is not doing. Philanthropy can be nimbler. It can do things more quickly. It can be flexible. It can take a longer-term view. It can fund more support for longer periods, which allows scientists to really do things that are more bold and riskier. And it's less constrained by politics. So it doesn't have to worry, as the federal government does, of funding institutions in small states as well as Massachusetts, right? And it can kickstart government funding. We've seen examples where gifts from philanthropy have actually gotten big government programs off the ground. The BRAIN Initiative is a great example of that. So the Science Philanthropy Alliance was formed in 2012. It was just at the time when we began to see the federal funding for research declining. And the mission from the very beginning was very clear. So our mission is to increase private support for basic science research. Clear mission, but it was really hard to figure out what the strategy should be. The board, which I'll tell you about in a while, tried a number of things, and they were about to give up completely, and then they hired me, and that was their last resort. And I had no idea what the strategy should be either. But we began to meet with wealthy individuals and their representatives who were interested in science, and we began to understand that they found funding science very difficult. They found it daunting. One of them said frightening. And so we realized that with our member organizations, and I'll tell you who they are in a moment, we had the expertise to advise philanthropists on effective ways of supporting science. And we thought, and we still believe, that if they're effective, they'll get satisfaction out of it and they'll keep doing it. If they make mistakes, they'll be embarrassed and they won't want to keep doing it. So being advisors to philanthropists is our strategy. As I said, there's a challenge, which is philanthropists find the landscape very complex. Our business model, if you can think of it as a business, which it's not, is to have our member organizations support our activities so that we can provide these advising services for free to new philanthropists. So what do? We advise them about mechanisms for funding. We connect them with other scientists, and most important, with our other philanthropists. They meet our member organizations, and our members can tell them about their experiences. And we create documents about best practices in science philanthropy, so we inform them. And we have meetings and workshops where these philanthropists can get together in a protected environment where no one's asking them for money, and they can talk to each other, and that really is a very beneficial thing. So this is an example of a couple of philanthropists we advised. This is Marc Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan, and you can see that this is when they were expecting their first child. So this was August of 2015. We were introduced to them by word of mouth, and we began advising them and worked with them for over a year until last September, when they made this wonderful announcement that they're going to commit $3 billion over 10 years for basic research in the life sciences. And it's really basic research. They're going to be developing tools and approaches for really solving the fundamental problems underlying human disease. So that's a great success. It's one we can talk about. Others of our advisees don't want us to talk about them or even mention their names, and that's completely understandable. When we meet with the new philanthropists, we explain that we're not raising funds. We don't ask them, and we don't want them to give us money. We want them to give BU money or other institutions. We want them to support the science. And so we don't make grants, and we're not an advocacy organization. We're not going to go to the federal government and advocate for more funding. Many of our member organizations really want to stay far away from any advocacy. We have two kinds of members. The full member organizations have seats on our board. So this is our board of directors. Robert Kahn of the Kavli Foundation is our chair. Harvey Feinberg is president of the Moore Foundation. Paul Joskow is president of the Sloan Foundation. Aaron O'Shea, president of Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Jim Smith is the head of science at the Wellcome Trust. The Wellcome Trust is the newest of our full members, so now we have a footprint in the United Kingdom. Jim Simons is not the president of his foundation, he's just the founder of his foundation. And Danny Gash is interim president of a small foundation you may never have heard of, Research Corporation for Science Advancement, but that's one of probably the oldest science funder foundation in the country. It's over 100 years old, and it has a long list of Nobel Prize winners in physics and chemistry, to which it gave very small grants when they were young faculty members. These are our full members. They take ultimate responsibility for our operating expenses. But we've now added associate members. These are sometimes smaller organizations, such as the Lasker Foundation. The Lasker Foundation is a very small foundation, but has an outsized impact because it gives the Lasker Prizes, which are quite well known as precursor to the Nobel Prize. And Mary Lasker's mission was to increase funding for basic biomedical research, and so their mission is very closely aligned with us. So that's an example of one limit, but you can also see the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. That's a very big effort, but they're very new to science philanthropy. They're not ready to make the kind of commitment that more established foundations make to our efforts. So these are supporters of ours, but not at the same level as the full ones. We now have a total of 22 members. So when I started, there were just the 6 founding members, and we now have 22. And this is a statement, I think, of how important, how many philanthropists see basic science as an important thing to support. They think our mission is important, and we're doing some good for them, and they really find it valuable to meet with the other philanthropists. We also have a couple of consultants whose names you may recognize, David Baltimore and Robert Bergeneau. You may think that this is my MIT bias because David, of course, was the first founder of the Whitehead Institute, and Bob was Dean of Science at MIT. But actually, they were consultants before I was hired, so I take no responsibility. And Robert Jan, who was president of HHMI and now returned to Berkeley, he was on our board before he became a consultant. The consultants are very important. I can, if you're interested, you can ask me what they do. This is our senior advising staff. There are just 3 of us, and we spend a huge amount of time talking to philanthropists and their staffers about really the nuts and bolts of science philanthropy. So let me tell you some of the questions that we get from philanthropists. First, and probably the most common question we get is, where are the gaps in funding? What can I do that no one else is doing? I had one funny experience where at one of our meetings, a woman who works for a billionaire came up to me and she said, "We want to put our money where no one else is putting it. What should we do?" And I pointed out the survey and said, you know, if you really want to have an impact, give the money for physics or chemistry or mathematics. And she said, "Oh no, I meant where are the gaps in cancer research?" And so we began trying to help her find gaps in cancer research, which is not easy these days. But I think we know that all of the philanthropists really do want to do something that no one else is doing. And they want to have an impact. And they want to be able to measure impact. And this is an interesting thing, is that even the most well-established foundations we work with, like the Wellcome Trust, are still struggling with how do you measure the impact of science funding. Because we all know that the impact actually often takes decades to really measure. And so, you know, your board of trustees won't wait that long, and you need to have some measure. So we've actually had 3 workshops where almost all of our member organizations attended, discussing what are the best ways of measuring the impact of basic science funding. What funding mechanisms are there? This is something we get asked all the time. And the first thing I always say is that you should do what our friend Rajan did, which is to find an institution that you trust and let them make the decisions. I think that what the universities in the United States do better than any institutions in the world is to hire the best people and give them the resources they need. And so we always say that if you want to do it in an easy way, an effective way, a way that you will be proud of, give money to a great institution and let them make the decisions, because they are going to protect their reputation over the long term, and they're going to be around for a long term. What companies in the world have been around as long as the great universities? None. And so this is a really safe bet. We always say that. However, many of the people we talk to say, well, I don't want to do that. I want to fund an area of science, and I know that the best people are at many different institutions, and I want to find the best people who are doing the most exciting things. And so we help them think through whether they should fund individuals, whether they should create a program. There are many, many options, and we walk them through that. Effectiveness, that's really the general issue of how do you do this well. And the most common question we get along those lines is, how do I form a strong science advisory board? So if you are not going to trust an institution, then what you need to do is to have members of the scientific community that you can rely on to help you make the decisions. And it astounds me how people who are so effective in the business world can make mistakes when they start putting together a science advisory board. They may get enamored with a particular scientist, fund him, and it's usually a him, not a her, and then ask him to be chair of their science advisory board. The simplest issues of conflict of interest are just not appreciated. And so we have made a document walking through all the steps of creating a science advisory board, including drafting letters, appointing the board, and having terms of service and so on. And so we really try to work through those kinds of mechanistic things so that people will not feel embarrassed by what they do. That would be the worst thing in the long run. And that's the last topic. So that's what we do, and I'm happy to stop there and answer any questions.